All right, here we go. Well, I'm really excited to share this topic today because it's something that I've learned about. I actually looked in my email when I first learned about multidimensional human design, which is a term by Dr. Eleanor Haspel-Portner. And I first learned about it in 2016. I had my email from her, and I actually want to look at my multidimensional human design body graph. And I want to actually seriously review the information that she presents in her own original research. It was her original research that was essentially tasked by Ra, especially in the development. She helped to develop the dream rave and to look at the 15 mammalian body graph gates. But also, she's done a bunch of original research in other areas that human design has incorporated and integrated that Ra essentially used but never himself researched, and would tell her that's a dead end. So there's a few of those. One of them is the Kabbalah. We understand that the Kabbalistic, there's various names of them, but paths of truth or paths of initiation that you can take. You can essentially realize which channel in your human design body graph associates to which of these on the Sephiroth, which of these lines, the point from, like, so basically you have the points of the Sephiroth and then you have the lines that connect those points, and those are the paths of truth, or there's various names for them, paths of initiation, things like that. But
This is synchronistic. I picked up 3 books at the free library by the bike path today on Kabbalah for the layman.
wonderful. We get so much good stuff in Santa Fe. I go by the same ones, and I also drop off books there, as I'm sure you do. And we get the best stuff in Santa Fe. We have such a gathering of people from so many different backgrounds here. So one of the interesting takeaways is that when she was researching Tarot, Ra would say, no, 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 don't bother. And she's researching Kabbalah, and Ra saying, don't bother. Well, she kept going with it. But what she was able to do in her connection with him was he basically tasked her with a lot of dream rave and mammalian research. So she was really looking at what's the difference if you look at 88 degrees retrograde of the moon instead of the sun in arc degrees, right? If you're actually going back, which is about 6 days or 7 days. And so that is, of course, the calculation that we use for the dream rave. Now, we use it with a five-centered, basically the same as the mammalian body graph, and that is accurate for the analysis of the dream rave because that's the level of analysis of the sleeping form. But she diverged from Ra, and this was the beginning of their divergence, when she said that actually you can apply that same dream rave calculation to a 64 gate body graph. And we have to learn how to interpret this now. This opens up the first interpretive problem. Now, here's my analysis, not hers. I'm going to present her information, and I'll kind of then do my analysis, and I'd love to hear others as well. My analysis is that the first problem that she encountered, which really opened up the problem of what she ended up calling her multidimensional body graph, which shows these different calculations, is the problem of how do we interpret the dream rave on the waking form. And Ra tended to look at the dream rave's imprint on the waking form using the 15 gate 5-centered matrix and looking at weak point analysis, which would be, for instance, say I have a split definition in my normal body graph. If I had that bridging gate in my dream rave, and I had that whole channel in the dream rave, that would make that split extra strong. But see, I don't even have a split. I just have a hanging gate in my waking body graph. Well, nevertheless, I may still have a strong conditioning factor if I have that whole channel, or if I have its opposite, but particularly that whole channel in my dream rave. So say I have a conscious, like my conscious 28, if I had a dream rave 38, that is to say, if 38 were in the transits about 6 days before my time of birth, which is when the dream rave is calculated, 88 degrees retrograde of the moon, if that were the case, then that 2838 would act almost like a bridging gate in terms of how its conditioning factor would pull me into that channel being a very important theme for me, because I'd wake up every morning and it would be as if the rug is pulled out from under me. I would feel that I have that energy to struggle for purpose, but then, see, I'm not actually designed to struggle. I'm only designed to collaboratively struggle. with someone like Johnny who has gate 38. So we make a really great team duo programming because we can struggle together. We're designed to do it. Separately, we each have a dormant potential to struggle, but we're not really designed to significantly struggle like somebody who has 2838, like Mike, who's just struggling all the time. He's just designed for it. We don't. We have a dormant potential to do that, but it's a hanging gate. It can pull us into something else, something collaborative that comes out of us. But in any case, say that I had that in the dream rave, I'd be waking up every morning, similar to like if I hung out with Johnny for a long time and I'm like working on a book and it's really hard, but I'm rewriting it. And I'm, something that really requires a lot of 2838, just but I have a strong sense of purpose. And then I leave Johnny's aura for a while and I'm off in my own aura and I go on a camping trip. I'm by myself. Can't write a single page. Can't bring myself to do it. No energy to struggle, right? He's been powering my struggle. Well, similarly, the dream rave will power your struggle if I have that 38 there, but when you wake up, it's gone. It's as if it was only in your aura while you were sleeping in a way, and now it's pulled away from you. You wake up in the morning and you're kind of like, oh, I have to struggle, but I can't because I don't have energy to. And so then you become addicted to somebody who has 38 or something like that in the same way that the bridging gate can become a real problem for people. Doesn't have to be a problem. It can also just be something that they experience. There's no real issue with having a weak point in your chart. It just kind of creates an extra accent of, oh, here's something else that's going to be a little more important for you that you might not have noticed. Now, that is when you're looking at the 15-gate matrix, because that's really what actually conditions you when you're sleeping. But say you have, I don't know, 6447 during this. Well, you don't have a head or a ajna in the 5-centered matrix. So that's not even looked at. And then the question would be, what would that even do? Like, what would the significance of that be? So Eleanor Haspel-Portner, Dr. Eleanor Haspel-Portner has really opened up this question starting there, but now I'm going to actually share my screen and you're going to find something really, really interesting here. So let me find, I had pulled it up right before. It's my multidimensional, and if anyone's interested, by the way, you can request your multidimensional body graph or chart from her website. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll see. So this was in 2016. I got it from her, and I think it can be. It raises a lot of questions of how it should be interpreted. And so here we go. I'm just going to share this now. Let me go share. Okay. Got it. It's going to take just 1 second. I'm in this other mode. There we go. Okay. I guess I just share the whole desktop. Okay, there we go. So this is basically the first thing we want to look at is the prenatal solar date. This prenatal solar date, I'm going to see if I can draw on this really quick. Okay. This prenatal solar date here is my design date. So this is a familiar date to me. I've already done a lot of research into this, for instance, making an astrological chart for it, doing what Ross said with astro location stuff where you kind of look at your astrocartography for your design. So this is already a date, the 26th of June, 1983 at 1:08 p.m. and 38 seconds. And that is in Universal Time or Greenwich Medium Time. Greenwich Medium Time there. And that's basically the one we're already familiar with. Now, the other one that we're also familiar with is the prenatal lunar date. This is the date around 6 days before you're born that is used for the mammalian 5-centered dream rave, basically, because we have a similar, we go into our 5-centered form in the dream rave. But here you can see it's not 5-centered. She's showing all of them. There's also something else she shows that does not cause activation, and but I was really fascinated by her use of it, and we discussed this, and I think this is worthy of its own separate discussion, and maybe in a moment we can just open up to discussion there once we just finish this overview. That is her use of Chiron, and Chiron is shown in green here. So, yeah. Chiron is shown in green. How do I clear? There we go. Okay, so the things that I wanted to show really quick, and then I'll open up to the discussion. She looks at a very interesting 6-month window of time. It's the 6-month window of 3 months before your time of birth and 3 months after your time of birth, the so-called fourth trimester after birth, where even though the baby's been born, it's still developing in a way that it takes a whole Mercury cycle of 88 days to come around to having all of its cognitive functions online. So you can actually see how the lunar cycle takes 28 days, and there's something like an emotional body formed for the baby in its 28th day after. It has its first lunar return. Then you have its first Venus, you have its first Mercury return, then that's 88 days. Then its first Venus return after that, still less than a year. And then you have its birthday, and then you have Mars return, and so on, all the way up to the ones we're more familiar with, the Saturn return, Uranus opposition, and eventual return, Chiron opposition. So you have these markers that really do continue on. I think the real question that she opens up here, and this is my analysis here, is that how are these to be interpreted? Because Ra himself would look at key dates, for instance, leading up to his encounter with the voice. He would look at the key transits at certain times, and he would run body graphs for those transits. And he'd be really interested in seeing what shook out from that. So I'm going to open up the discussion in about 1 minute here, but I just want to just finish here by showing the sort of phases from before birth to after birth, and then finish with one really interesting observation that she discovered. So you start 3 months before. This was 3 months before I was born, and you look at what were the conditions 3 months before I was born. Then you go to 6 days before I was born. That's my dream rave. That's my lunar. That's my mammalian body graph. And she calls it spiritual and dream, because it's kind of connected to the spiritual dream world, compared to my conscious waking reality, which relates to that first date. Because that first date is sort of 3 months before birth, when the fetus is kind of, the nervous system wakes up in a certain way, supposedly anyway. It does raise a very interesting question about this. There's a normative sort of thing here, expecting the 9-month birth, but what about premature birth, like Ra's own son, who was born at 6 or 7 months, which is actually quite common, or Ra himself, who was a C-section. All of these kinds of questions, of course. But leaving those aside, it does kind of make sense. Okay, 6 days before I was born, what was going on? That had some conditioning effect, imprinting me in a way that every time I go to sleep, I experience that imprint. Well, now she looks at the prenatal solar minute, which is the 2-day period before birth. And I was a long labor. It was something like 20 hours. So that's very much in the beginning of this 2-day period before birth, some sort of trigger that kicks off the birth, which again raises the question, this is all very normative, but there's also C-sections, in which case this doesn't happen. And she has a very deep understanding. She's a doctor of psychology, but also has a very, very incredible understanding of biology and different processes like that. So, for instance, though, if you look at the what are they like Braxton Hicks, or what's the term for the contractions?
Braxton Hicks.
Yeah. Okay. Braxton Hicks contractions. That would, for instance, often be in the critical 90-minute prenatal lunar period. So you have basically 3 months, 6 days, 2 days, 90 minutes. So these are like phases of triggers, imprinting, new systems coming online. And as they come online, facilitating the birth process, kicking off Braxton Hicks to make the go into labor, to make, I guess you're already in labor a lot of times at that point, but to make the baby drop, different things like that happening, right? So, and then there's the time of birth. And there's some very interesting, so from here it actually jumps over to the bottom right, all the way over to the 90 minutes after birth, which is this critical 90-minute window right after birth, where the baby takes 90 minutes to fully adjust to having been born, and then there's this imprint of like its first moment kind of at rest in the new world. And then there's the 2-day period after birth of how it's imprinted emotionally. What's going on? Is it maybe at the time of birth there weren't any of these imprints happening, but 2 days later you have all of this stuff and it has emotional definition during that time. Well, obviously that's not going to cause emotional definition in the aura. We know it doesn't because we've been experimenting. We have enough, human design evidence, at least from our side. Now there might be counter evidence, and she also did some very interesting research into her own, attempts to validate different conclusions or potential conclusions from this information. But what does it mean that 2 days after I was born, there's an activation that would cause a defined solar plexus? I don't have a defined solar plexus, but maybe that 3536 was in the transit, even though I have a totally undefined solar plexus, something like that. There are these interesting cases. I didn't have that totally, but I did have like 35, for instance, there, and then 36 here. But anyway, she looks at then the 6 days after. That's the 88 degrees of the moon after your birth, and then 88 degrees of your sun after your birth. Which, of course, there's for every 5-1, there's a 2-5 or a 3-5 out there for whom my personality is their design. Just like I'm a 5-1, there's a 1-3 or a 1-4 out there somewhere for whom my design is their personality, depending on if I'm born in the earlier or later part of the fifth line. But it's just an interesting little fact there, right? So, like the design date. So, and now here's the final kicker, and then I'll open up the discussion. We start at 3 months before, we end 3 months after. What has happened in that 3 months before to 3 months after? Well, the sun has moved through 6 months of gates. Mm-hmm. But the earth has also moved through 6 months of the opposite gates. So that human life form, starting 3 months before birth, when it kind of boots up 3 months before it's born and is like starting to have some kind of experience of things, has now experienced the genetic activation of all 64 gates from the sun and the earth. Guaranteed, bar none. They've had one complete pass-through of that sun-earth 180-degree polarity. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So they're guaranteed. I mean, obviously the moon has gone around also 6 times or 7 times since then. So they've already had all 64 gates programmed by the moon 6 or 7 times. But the sun, which is really the primary programming, and its earth as its partner there, its kind of complement, really have gone through. So I'm going to open this up to discussion. Any thoughts? Anyone like to comment? I'd love to hear Lustita's thoughts. Anyone else as well? Nancy, Marissa, Monique. And I see we have comments on chat. So let me also, sorry, just a moment here. Trying to disable my, we're the full screen now. Oh, there we go. Got it. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, who would like to comment? Should I read some of the comments here, or okay? Oh, okay. Well, let me just see. I guess there's no comments here. Well, we can just open up the conversation here. Any comments on this end, Johnny?
So our design date is just 3 months prior to birth, but prior to our design date is 6 months of gestation, right? So all in all, that's 360 degrees if you have 9 months plus 3 months after birth.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. That the normal 9-month birth without cesarean section or other things that happen premature birth, but that the normal expected, that we actually brings us to a full year. So it's kind of like this missing 4th trimester rounds out. Really, the first 3 months of the baby's life kind of rounds out. It's still being imprinted. It's still open to the cosmic frequencies, and it's actually the exact Mercury return. Well, I shouldn't say exact Mercury return, but it's interesting because Ross said that the voice told him it was a Mercury cycle, which is basically 88 days. But I say basically is not exactly, or 88 degrees of the sun. But we use exactly 88 degrees of the sun, which does depend on, sometimes it's 87 days, sometimes 89 days, sometimes it's 90 days. And it does not synchronize to the Mercury cycle of 88 days. The Mercury cycle of 88 days is more constant in that sense than the sun. The sample you take because of our relationship to the sun and the tilt, the angular tilt. I discovered this in programming human design software, that you actually can't just assume a constant value. There's no constant value. Like the time between your design date and your birth date might be 90 days. Time between mine and mine might be 87.5 days. It's different depending on what time of year you were born. So, well, let's take a look then at some of the actual I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to look, I guess, just at my body graph, and we're going to just look at some of the ways we could possibly interpret it or question it, because it's not that I get activation. It's not like this addition of activation. It's more, there's a couple interesting ways to approach it. So, okay, here's one way to approach.
What are the design dates? How are they calculated?
Well, you can see that the personality will be on one side and the design on the other. It's an interesting way. I'll let you all look at it for a minute. Sometimes it's the same, like in this prenatal lunar minute, it's not. Well, that doesn't change much, I guess. But, okay, so here are some of the takeaways, though. For one thing, it's kind of a similar question to the question of what were the astrological transits like around the time of birth. And you can even do this game of what were the popular songs? What was the number one song in the world when you were born? Mm-hmm. What were the most popular TV shows? When I was born in September 1983, what was going on in the world? So that's already an interesting question, because that will kind of, it's a similar form of analysis to say, well, let's look at the transits before and after the person was born and kind of see what was going on. Now, if these are very key dates, which they do have a certain logical, mirror image. Even if you just take two of them, it's the mirror image of the design date for the moon and the design date for the sun, which is that is to say the dream rave and your design calculation. So you take the design of the dream rave and the design of your normal calculation, you just invert them and you just do 6 days after and then you do 3 months after, right? Or, I'm saying roughly, of course, because you have to actually look at exactly 88 degrees of the sun, exactly 88 degrees of the moon, and then going lower to subdivide exactly 88 arc minutes of the sun and exactly 88 arc minutes of the moon using degrees, minutes, seconds notation. So it's not 88 minutes in the sense of an hour and a half, it's 88 minutes on the wheel of the sun, which works out to 2 days, and 88 minutes on the wheel of the moon, which works out to 2 hours. So in any case, when we look at these, how do we interpret them? It certainly doesn't mean that I have a defined head and ajna. It certainly doesn't mean that I have 35-36 just because my postnatal solar date has 36 and my prenatal lunar date has 30. Or vice versa, has 36. Yeah, or 515, right? My postnatal solar date has 515. Doesn't mean that I have these. Also, there's Chiron, which Rob very specifically said does not cause activation. And yet, it could have interpretive value. So that's going to be, I'll share it again in a moment, but I think just at a very high level, what I want to convey is that there may be interpretive value of looking at different dates in the same way that Ra looked at his encounter with the voice, and he looked at key dates leading up to that encounter with the voice when certain things happened, and he looked at the transits, and he looked at how he was triggered in a certain way. His gate 40, line 2, which I guess was active during his encounter with the voice, also had prior sort of, like there are certain like setups, like the previous time you had a certain line, or the previous time, just certain configurations that he sort of saw as the machinations of the world, or of the transits rather, that were basically working with him at a very personal level. So I think we do see that, and it's almost like if you wanted to kind of put on a very imaginative hat of, let's imagine what the transits around the time of your birth have to say about your myth. Not a literal reading that this causes activation, but we know that Chiron is a myth, for instance, that we all have a relationship to. Every human being alive has a relationship to the Chiron myth. It's one of our 9-centered myths. It emerged in the 9-centered time. Just like we all have a relationship to the Eris myth and others. Obviously these are ancient Greek myths, but they've come to prominence as we've had planetary bodies named after them and so on. So having this relationship to Chiron, well, for me, Chiron would be in gate 20, and that's something that we saw in that. Just at that level alone, it doesn't mean I have gate 20. I'm not a manifesting generator. I know I'm not, because believe me, if I had 3420, I see 3420s and how much they're able to get done. You have 3420. I have 3420 friends. I recognize that, and I also recognize the compromise I have with it. So how do we interpret it? Well, it could be that my relationship to Chiron has something to do with gate 20, something to do with awakening to the now, something to do with what I want to put out into the world through my hard work and effort. And then I'm looking for, it's almost like when a 20 comes into my life, or when a transit comes into my life and gives me that 20 temporarily, that allows me to do Chiron themed things and actualize the next step in some sort of healing journey. It's like this interpretive, almost archetypal layer on top of it, in the same way that if my emotional, because here's what she really breaks it down to. She says there's a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual imprint. And if I have a defined solar plexus in the mental, right, or versus the physical versus the spiritual, it's like these interesting cross sections. It doesn't mean I have a defined solar plexus. What it means is every time somebody activates my solar plexus, I get really mental about it, or I get really physical about it, or I get really, right, or something like that. Like it brings, it's almost, an interpretive lens would be, well, actually, I shouldn't use the example of mental, because that one's kind of a special case, and we can go into that later if we get to that level of nuance. But if we're looking at just physical, emotional, spiritual, and say we just look at the emotional and the spiritual imprints. The spiritual imprint is 6 days before birth. I'm going to go ahead and share this screen again. That's what she calls it. She calls it the spiritual imprint. We in human design just say this is the dream rave. But she looks at it with all 64 gates, which is not to say, okay, Jonah, you really have 64 or 47. It's to say, when your 47 lights up, when somebody, because I have a hanging 64, when I get that temporary 47 energy, maybe that does tap me into the spiritual world, where I suddenly start to get a rush of spirit archetypal images. See what I'm saying? Like I'm tapped in there. So normally I just have a dormant gate there that's just kind of waiting to plug in. And it's kind of multi-use. It'll plug into anybody. It'll plug into any 47 that comes along. My 64 is just ready in my aura. And then sometimes, but then when I plug in with them, what ends up happening? I start getting a rush of spiritual images, or I start getting. Now, on the other hand, you look at the emotional, and that's the 2 days after I was born. Now, I don't have a good example there because I don't have extra activation there. But say I had splenic activation there. It would be so unusual then to say, well, when your spleen is activated, you have an emotional way of experiencing that. And yet what it would mean is, in those 2 days after I was born, say something came along and made me just feel so good because the transits were just conditioning me with a defined spleen, then it pulled it away from me, I would have an emotional attachment to feeling splenically defined. Well, we actually see that with a lot of people. A lot of people are in relationships where they can't get out of that relationship because they're so emotionally attached, because it's reminding them of that same feeling that same chemical cocktail they got when they were 2 days old. And they don't even remember they got it. They have no conscious access to that imprint from being only 2 days old and imprinted with this feel-good safety chemical cocktail of a defined spleen. Other people have an undefined spleen, are not super attached in an emotional relating way. This may be, I'm not saying this is, but this may be an explanation for those nuances. Why is it that some people with an undefined spleen become really attached in relationships to someone who defines their spleen? Others don't. Ra always used that as an example. He would say that undefined spleen kid who's being abused but actually loves the abuser so much because they're so attached splenically they can't let go of them. Well, there's plenty of undefined spleen people who have no problem letting go. But what if they were defined in the emotional chart, so it's saying at 2 days old, they got that jolt of splenic feel-good and they're chasing it? It's going to tell you something different. So I just think, regardless of any conclusions, and I think it's possible to make very large statements, and I think we should always ask, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek said, philosophy begins when we stop arguing over what something really means, or it really is, and we start asking what the other person means by that. So I think it's easy, like looking on Dr. Eleanor Haspel-Portner's site. She's obviously very brilliant, very smart. She can make bombastic statements. Like she told me, for instance, around 95% of people are manifesting generators in their composite, and that the world is kind of full of people who have this experience of being manifesting generators. And I said, well, yeah, but there's still, 10% manifestors and 20% projectors. And I think instead of arguing, is the breakdown really 70, 30, 10? Obviously, that is the breakdown at the level that we're studying. And we've obviously confirmed that at the level we're studying. She's studying a different level of saying, what does it mean to be a composite manifesting generator? Maybe that's an explanation for why all these people who aren't designed to be MGs run around and act like MGs. And maybe it is healthy for them to simultaneously realize that they're not manifesting generators in their body graph. There's a huge deconditioning from that, but also realize that because they're manifesting generators in their composite, which is the combination of all the body graphs plus the 33 degrees after or something like that. It's just, I'm generalizing it, maybe not all the body, but it's like this, because 95% of people are manifesting generators in this composite, that actually operates in multiple layers, this multidimensional thing, that just means they're still designed to do the kind of thing of like outputting work into the world. Like Ra himself was a manifester who made incredible, copious amounts of materials, graphic designs, all these things. Well, guess what? He had a lot of help from transits and from conditioning fields of his kids. And, you know, he had his one son had 39, 55, 22 plugging into his 12. And he himself said, after his son was born, he found it so much easier to communicate because he had that conditioning field so regularly available. So I guess I'm just saying there's a real idea that we have to decondition, which is true, but also, what if most projectors who might get the idea, hey, I need to decondition from working so hard all my life and pretending to be a manifesting generator when I'm not, or trying to be even a manifester, trying to make my life happen. Well, okay, decondition from that. Simultaneously, realize that the reason you've been so drawn to that is because most people actually do have some sort of purpose fulfilled through the throat, regardless if they have an undefined throat, regardless of their type, regardless if they have the energy or not. They're designed to be collaborative. They're designed to work with others and to take their piece of it. And so you have a mental projector who's guiding the thing, and then you have a splenic projector who's guiding another part of it, and then you have the generator and they're bringing their energy. And I mean, it's just kind of like, instead of like, let's just challenge our own imaginations a little bit, not to be so dogmatic, because I see a lot of dogmatic, closed-minded human design, not among real human design analysts and practitioners, not among those actually taking classes and learning the system, but just among kind of the general masses of Facebook and Reddit forum and stuff like that. And a lot of what I see is just kind of this small-mindedness of, hey, I'm a projector, I'm not here to work, hey, I'm this, I'm not here to that, I'm not this. Well, I think what the multidimensional body graph is showing is that regardless of what you actually have available to you on a day-to-day basis, which really is your birth imprint and your 88-degree retrograde of the sun imprint, the other imprints they're still a part of you, and they still have extra information. And we're only beginning to scratch the surface of what that information, how it may be interpreted. So instead of asking, well, does it really make a difference if you have this or that after you're born? Did it really make a difference if 2 days after you were born or 3 months after you were born, Saturn opposed Pluto and you had that happen in this? And, you know, well, obviously everything makes a difference, obviously. Does it make more or less of a difference is a question that is worth experimenting with and exploring. And then I think that's something that Rod just didn't have the energy to do because he had his task. He's a desire guy. I know what it's like. I'm a desire guy, and I know what it's like to just have my blinders on. And in fact, that is mostly how I am, is basically just, my task is to stay true to what I'm committed to and locked into. My task is not to explore out of some innocent curiosity, wanting to observe and see for myself what everything else has. I can rely on the innocence people for that. So for the most part, I don't, at the same time, I don't have to do the work that Ra had to do. Ra had this tremendous undertaking, which was birthing an incredible, fully formed, deep, rich, complicated system into the world and universalizing it and getting it to stick, getting it to stay there and getting it out there in a way that it can be accessed, that isn't corrupted and isn't lost and is preserved. And that's an incredible undertaking. Since he did that, we now have the freedom to kind of start to explore some of the repercussions of these explorations. And I think Eleanor Haspel-Portner's work is one such way. I just think in the past, maybe it wasn't the right time. And of course, part of her split with Ra was sort of the pre-philosophical who's right, who's wrong. And I think with Zizek, we should say philosophy begins when we stop asking, well, which one is really true? Now, in some cases, I'm not going to be this lenient. When it comes to sidereal human design or something, I have a hard line that is not worth exploring because the rationale for it is completely invalid and the originator was actually deceptive. But in the case of Dr. Eleanor Haspel-Portner, all I've seen is a very ardent 3-5 researcher who is extremely devoted to seeing for herself, as all third lines should, and exploring and experimenting. And she's found some really interesting things, but I think it can lead to bombastic statements like, well, 95% of people in their composite are manifesting generators. What does that mean? What does that mean? It's not changing their aura, but it could be saying that 95% of people are being conditioned to work really hard and be busy all the time, which sounds pretty accurate to me. So it's like, how do we interpret these things? That's really the question is. And I don't know that she's so busy doing all these, I mean, she's doing really vast and deep research into the Kabbalah and associations with tarot cards and all sorts of things that are kind of leading her into all these different areas of research, always through the lens of the four worlds: the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So she puts everything through this four-world lens, and which I think is a very worthy endeavor, a very interesting endeavor. But because of that, I think it's actually up to us, those who would pick up her work, to say what it means, because she's just found something interesting, and she does have some observations, like looking at my body graphs here, seeing that head ajna in the prenatal lunar and the postnatal lunar, it's both spiritual. That's the only time I have defined head ajna. And so because of that, I think what it would be saying, one form of interpretation, is that normally, okay, so before my deconditioning, this was my personal experience, I would often force myself to use my head to solve problems, use my ajna to solve problems and to know things and to figure it out, even though I didn't want to. And yet my great skill was I could show up on a job and I could immediately pick up what everybody else was doing. And so I knew that was my skill, but I wasn't only playing to my strength, I was also playing to my weakness, which was doing the hard work itself. Part of my deconditioning has been literally becoming so comfortable with not knowing something that I am able to just next time I talk to Johnny, I hope I remember or something, to tell him. I'll probably remember, and he'll think about it. And so as an example, when we do programming sessions, a lot of times I will just leave a comment of what I need to do, because my awareness, I always say the openness is where we bring awareness. I bring awareness to all of the problems that need to be solved. And I make little notes in the code and I say, this problem needs to be solved. We haven't done that yet. Oh, we better do this. That's going to take a lot of work. Geez. Then I get Johnny, and if I can get him to start thinking about it, he starts cranking away on it with his defined head ajna, cross of consciousness, and he starts going, I wonder how we would do that. And then he said, well, what about this, Jonah? And he kind of, So I've seen how my deconditioning has been that I no longer feel this need to try to solve everything. It's kind of like before deconditioning, you're trying to be every single center. After, you just bring awareness to it, and the awareness is what fills in the openness instead of the automatic reaction. So you become really unreactive in that way. Someone's like, I have a problem. I used to be like, oh, let me help you with it. Let me solve it. Let me do it. Now it's just a very unreactive kind of, okay, so you don't understand. You don't know how that works. I understand what you're saying. You don't know how that works. Instead of, let me try to help you, let me try to convince you, who knows what, right? So, and I can feel that where I've noticed that trying to solve other people's problems afterwards, you kind of almost need to scrub your mind clean a little bit. I don't have to do that as much anymore because I'm not using it for the dirty work of thinking about somebody else's problem in a way that exhausts me. Then I'm tired and brain dead. And it's almost like I'm keeping myself really fresh and refreshed all the time. Okay, so I know I don't have a defined head ajna because I've observed this whole change of how before I just had these automatic push button trigger responses. Now I have all this awareness that has sort of filled in the openness, and I'm able to notice all the problems that need to be solved and be okay with not knowing them, and just kind of, and even maybe talk about which ones should be solved first and which are interesting and not, and which ones actually have value, but even admit that I'm not going to be the one to determine that. I'll bring them to Johnny and say, look, these are some of the problems I found. He goes, don't even bother with that one. He's the defined head ajna. I'll let him, be the discerner in that way, and I'll bring the same problems to a different defined head ajna, and then I'll judge from what each of them tell me which one I think is, has more clear thinking, right? Which one's really thought it through, which one's come up with a good solution. So that's my job, bringing awareness to the solutions of others. Now, how do we interpret that I have a defined head ajna only in my spiritual drive toward expression in the world and my spiritual dream body graph. Well, obviously, I'm not getting conditioning from it every night when I sleep. It's not that I go to sleep and have a defined head ajna. I don't even have a head ajna when I sleep. I only have 5 centers when I sleep. So that's not what's happening. What it's saying is that 6 days before I was born, gate 47 was active, which made that channel of abstraction with 64. And that same thing happened 6 days after. So my lunar quarter, my lunar 90 degree, no, it's 88 degrees rather, but my lunar roughly 90 degree quarter, and then that quarter again, both of those, and in fact we can even see what made it. We can see, let's see, what was the 47? The 47 was Mercury. So Mercury itself moved into 47 6 days after I was born, and 6 days before I was born, Mercury. How can Mercury be 47 6 days before I was born? Because that can't be possible. Did it retrograde? Maybe it retrograded out and then went direct again. Maybe that's why. Yeah, because it's in 64 for me and they're adjacent to each other. So that's what was happening. Mercury was direct at my time of birth, but it must have, there must have been some, it's at 64.6. So it retrograded right before my time of birth and it went direct. It was direct for me and then it kept going direct, and a week after, it was in the same place as it was a week before. So how funny. A week before I was born and a week after I was born, there was 47, and yet I don't have 47. Well, I don't think she's saying, or at least I'm not interpreting this as that I should act as though I actually have 47 in some way. I think the interesting thing here would be, if you look at what 6447 is like, actually John Martin had this, and he described it as having a very wet, imagistic, poetic mind. And it's true. He would talk in a very poetic way, in a very, using a lot of images and a lot of metaphor, just a lot of kind of imagistic things. Well, it doesn't mean that I'm going to always do this. I will when I'm around 47s, or when I have that, it's one of my attributes because I have that 64. But it could be that regardless of any of that, at a completely different level, I have a very tapped in kind of stream of abstract imagistic connection spiritually, that the spiritual world is kind of, to me, imagistic, and in that channel of abstraction is somehow connected to the spiritual world for me. It's not an emotional thing for me, even though it's an abstract emotional channel, and it's not a physical thing for me. See, again, I don't necessarily know how to apply the analytic content to this, and I certainly wouldn't do that for somebody coming to me for a first human design reading, although I also have confidence that people tend to go to the readers that they need. So there are people that maybe they do need a multidimensional human design reading from Dr. Haspel-Portner first, because that's their fractal. That's the whole idea of the fractal line, is that there are certain people that are going to learn better from this one lineage than they will from another lineage. So that's an interesting question. Now, the lineage that I teach, and when somebody comes to me, I'm not going to do this the same way I don't use Chiron in the first reading. I might be curious where Chiron is, and I might add the ability to see where Chiron is. That's actually something I've been curious about a few times, just because I want to see if I can find any interpretive value of that. But as a desire person, I come up for air for my curiosity to be appeased only long enough to get back to my desire. Somebody comes to me for a human design reading, I have one goal and one goal only, and that is to wake them up in a significant way that changes their decision-making process and how they relate, even if they're already in the human design experiment, that somehow deepens or furthers their ability to lock into their strategy and authority. That's my goal. So I'm not going to necessarily tell them where their Chiron is, unless I think that can help them in some way. But what I have found is that synchronistically, people tend to go to the readers they need, or they tend to go to a reader when that reader is learning about a certain technique that they want to kind of try out. They try it out for that person, give it to them, and it'll actually sometimes will magically work, even if later the reader stops using that technique, and then the person years later is like, oh, they were amazing, they did this great. They're like, they haven't done that for years, they don't even use that technique anymore. Well, for whatever reason, the people that kind of needed to hear that tend to find the people that say that at that time. So I'm not really worried about, to me it's very different looking at something like True Sidereal Human Design or Cosmic Human Design as developed by Richard Mason, because he was disingenuous in his statements, truly disingenuous, and does not have a strong reason for his adjustment. His reasoning that we should use the sidereal isn't even accurate because he's not even using the sidereal. He's just like arbitrarily adjusting the gate values in a way that kind of ruins a lot of things. So in his case, I don't think we need to like seriously put any effort to what he's saying of, oh, we should look into sidereal human design. We already do look into sidereal. It's called global cycle analysis, and that needs more work. So if people really want to put in, it's almost like if there were a college for like human design scholars and like what kind of master's thesis are people going to work on? Yeah, do some master's thesis on global cycles because that is so little understood. Nobody has actually gone through and looked at the lines and what happened in history and tried to tell the story of history through the lines. Not even Ra. He kind of said you could, and he hinted at how to do it, and he did a little bit of it. But I mean, you could write a book on that. But when it comes to actually adjusting the Rave mandala using the sidereal calculations in a way that changes everyone's type and so on, there's no real, we don't need to analyze that for any value there. But these calculations are calculations that Dr. Haspel-Portner has used for 22 years since discovering them and has made her own observations about them. But by and large, those observations have not been integrated or incorporated into any other practice besides her specific work in multidimensional human design. And I think it's just a testament to the vastness of her interests that, you know, she continues to explore Kabbalah and all these different systems and do all this great scholarly work. It's kind of, you know, she's going to keep doing that, but not necessarily. I mean, it's my hope that she will publish more of her findings also from the multidimensional. Like, what has she discovered in the past 20 years looking at these? What has she discovered common about people who have defined head and ajna only in the spiritual, right? Like me, right? What could you say about that? Versus somebody who has that only in the physical. The physical one is, the physical hormonal underlay is the 90 minutes before and after. And so it's interesting. It's kind of like the moment of birth marks the center of the physical, and she puts the 3 months before as the mental imprint. So you have the mental and the physical. The conscious is almost like the conscious physical experiencing of that. And then the 88 degrees before, the design date, she sees as the mental imprint, which I guess we would call the imprint of the unconscious from a psychoanalytic or Jungian perspective, but which Ra would just say was the design, but he would liken it to the unconscious or say it's the personality is like the conscious and the design is like the unconscious. And so she would kind of, and so it is interesting, like, to make the design date, the mental world is the world of the unconscious. And then to make the birth date, the physical world, actually explains that the personality then, it explains why personality activation still causes the aura. Because see, John Martin and Teresa Blanding would always criticize Ra for not calling out personality activation as not contributing in the same way to strategy and authority. And I believe they do. But they would say, oh, if you have personality activation, that's your personality, which they would kind of equate more with the mind. In the design side, they equate more with the body, right? And they would say, well, how can this mental activation that you have cause your strategy and authority? And that would be one of their big questions where they would diverge from Ra. And I would always defend Ra. And I would say, no, personality activations cause just as much chemical cocktail, just as much hormones of peace versus anger, or just as much, you know, hope versus pain, or just as much satisfaction versus frustration. However you want to look at it, all these dichotomies, you know, you can have a totally personality solar plexus defined. I have an open solar plexus. I'll feel it. I can feel the chemical cocktail of that. Well, Dr. Haspel-Portner says, well, of course, the personality imprint, the time of the personality, is right there in the middle of the critical 90-minute physical hormonal underlay and the postnatal 90-minute physical hormonal timer. So it's like right there in the middle of the physical. So your personality date is kind of the physical imprint, which would also explain why astrologers have been able to get by only using the personality date for so long, because they're not only describing, it's like we call it the personality, but there's a physical aspect of the personality as well. The personality is also the chemical cocktail of that person. So I have 2946 in my personality side activation. I have an actual energy of this. I've seen this kind of energy with other people too. Like I have this kind of like bon vivant, like lover of life. Let's go and have this adventure, and let's commit to this experience together. And it's kind of in the aura. It's like a chemical cocktail, this contagious chemical cocktail. And like, come with me. Like I'll pull you into this experience. And that's completely on my personality side. That's a personality activation. It's still in my aura. There's still a physical component to it. So that's already one of the interesting distinctions, is that we have the physical, the marriage of the physical and the mental. That's why the human design body graph is so powerful just as it is. Because the personality in the design is showing you your physical and conscious waking reality married to your mental world and your design, which is the mental world that you live in, which I guess also must have a physical component as well. I mean, obviously that causes aura to be. So it's interesting that she decides to call it, but she really just names it together. This is conscious waking reality. So this is just our normal conscious waking reality. That's our normal human design body graph. So that's our normal conscious waking reality. When we're in REM, that's our spiritual and dream kind of, we're getting visions in our dream world and stuff like that, spiritual visions. Then we get an emotional underlay. And so in my emotional underlay, I don't have anything extra. There's nothing extra in this. So my emotional underlay does not, I don't have, like, if I had emotional activation in it or something, it'd be an interesting question. What would my relationship then be? If it was, but my emotional underlay doesn't really add anything. Then we look at my physical underlay, also doesn't really add anything. There's no new activation. Really, we're looking for centers, or we're looking for new channels or new centers. Then we go over to the bottom right here, and we're in this postnatal lunar minute. We don't really, I mean, one thing we notice is that only my actual aura and my conscious waking reality has 952. Nothing else does. But they all have 4629 because they all make use of the personality date. So that would already say that if she is right, that these imprints are significant in some way, then it would make personality imprints in your human design body graph way more important because they're present at all levels. But a design imprint would not be present at all levels. So my 952 design, even though it's something I have access to through my conscious waking reality as this automatic unconscious response, but I'm aware as a conscious person that is going on, the sitting in stillness and programming and all this stuff, even though that 2946 would actually have an outsized influence because it is carried across every one of these. So I guess this is just saying that if she's right that these body graphs are significant, these extra world kind of, body graphs, then it makes personality activations way more significant because it says basically a personality channel is stronger in some sense than a design channel. Now, this is not something that I'm saying is true at all. I'm saying this is something that would need to be explored because I think a design channel, in my experience, seemingly can be just as significant. And what Ra would always describe is if it's on the design side, it can just be a surprise for someone or something that just happens and surprises them that they weren't aware of it. It doesn't necessarily seem like it's less strong, but this would be another reason why astrology works so well, quote unquote, is that personality imprint, that time of the exact birth, is carried across all of these body graphs. So if you have a personality channel, you get that channel in every single graph, whether it's on the personality or design side. It becomes the design side of the postnatal solar date, for instance, but it's still there. So it's an interesting question. Now, looking at my postnatal lunar minute, we don't really add anything. Neither do we in my solar minute. So really the only significant changes are this Mercury in 47.
Well,
That,
your root's not defined anymore.
well, yeah, my root's only defined in my actual body graph. It's not defined in any of the others.
Yeah.
Every single other one has an undefined root.
Right.
So I would say the two big significant things are my root was only
That's
very
not,
shortly.
that's not true. The prenatal solar drive has a root defined.
Well, that's what we're saying, but that's my actual real body graph. That's my real one. Like that's the one that's
No, but it's different than your body graph.
only because it has Chiron added. That's the green right
So
there.
you do have that 3410 in your
I have
real
34. I'm trying to zoom in, but it's not really letting me zoom. But there's no 10, but I do have 34. It's because of Chiron and green, it looks weird. It looks like it's reaching up. So normally it's really just a visual graphical issue because of the addition of Chiron. So, but actually that top left corner one is my actual, but no, I see what you're saying though. I mean, the rest of them, that's my real one, except for the addition of Chiron there, of course. I don't have 3420, I only have 34. But, but then the rest of them, I guess what it's saying is that that 52, well, yeah, because that was my design sun. The rest of them don't have 52.
Yeah.
So none of the others have 52. And then how do we interpret that? Well, I don't know other than I experienced 952, so I know that I have it because I experience it as a sort of automatic thing that I don't even notice happening. And then I go, oh, I must have really responded to that because I just spent 4 hours doing that and I feel great. I don't feel like I just got distracted or sidetracked. I feel like my energy was like, let's organize all of these things and let's actually do this. And I just kind of watch it happen automatically. The same way Ra with his unconsciously activated, his unconsciously defined ajna would notice himself saying things and he wouldn't really know where it came from. And he was like, oh, it just kind of came out of, I get to hear it for the first time the same time everyone else gets to hear it the first time. So we're all hearing it for the first time together. That's how my 952 is, but yeah, that is, and also, okay, yeah.
So I'm still confused.
Yeah.
Is that your birth chart? The prenatal solar date is in GMT time, so that's why it's different than the date of.
Well, I'm born September 25th, 1983 at 8:48 p.m. in Malden, Massachusetts, which is also the same as the 26th of September at midnight and 48 minutes. So this is 3 months before. This is my design date. But she's just only showing the design date here. But my birth date, see how it says natal date here? Basically, this is in black. So in that top left one, my birth date is being represented.
I see.
And then in red, my design date is being represented. So this is the only difference is the chart kind of almost looks like it has 3410, but it doesn't. But that's just a glitch. And it has Chiron, which is in gate 20 for me. So it's just showing where Chiron is. So that's kind of the funny one there.
Yeah.
Just make it a little bigger. So yeah, it's not the easiest to read. But really for me, the only real differences we have the 6447. So that would maybe just mean for me, I have some special relationship or association. Like what I've wondered is because it's the first time in your life you ever experienced that center being defined, what if when you have an undefined center and then you're imprinted, it's like defined in one of these, what that would mean would be one interpretation of that would be that the first time you experienced that, it imprinted you with that. So it kind of always takes you back to that place. So then when you meet someone who has that gate or something, like when I meet a 47, it always sort of activates a spiritual side of me compared to a physical or a mental or an emotional side. Now, I don't know necessarily how to interpret that. That's such a vague statement that I would need to kind of spend some time with it and look at what that even means. How do we interpret? What I really would need to see is people who have the same undefined centers, but different prenatal and postnatal solar and lunar charts. See, that's the way I would really scientifically go about it. I would say these people have the same basic configuration. They both have undefined solar plexus, but every time my solar plexus is defined, it's really physical. Every time it's defined for them, they make it really mental. And you can see that every time it's defined, they start to get a lot of ideas and mental sort of rationalizations. And for me, it's really physical. I have to go work out and exercise. Something like that. I physically work through my emotions. They mentally do. Something like that. I haven't yet seen that level. And also, I realized that the mental wouldn't really make sense because that is actually what gives us our aura. That is what she's calling prenatal solar date here. So that was a bad example, but maybe the physical versus the emotional or the spiritual.
Right.
But yeah, it's just interesting that she really is looking.
Right. So, I mean, I wrote you a note right at the beginning saying that I had hard feelings towards her. I mean, a lot of these people were very upsetting in Ra's life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, and
And
I understand that. I mean, having kind of been, yeah, he was looking for someone to help develop human design, and then she kind of went and developed a different direction
and
following
she
her own
tended to
research.
be right, and she tended to be very dogmatic.
Hmm.
And rather than humble, and I mean, it's good that she's been researching things and trying to find out, but her attitude doesn't seem to be that of a real student who wants to learn rather than
Yeah, I don't think that she was
teach.
necessarily a student of Ra or that interested in discussion. What she reminded me of in my investigation into her work, and we also were able to discuss and meet online, which was a real treat for me, is when I've had the opportunity in the past to work with very incredible, brilliant scholarly researchers who are so busy with their 81 different scholarly research insights that they don't really have time to do the actual connective tissue work of reintegrating it back into the systems that they've been interested in. So I can see how, in her case, as well as Richard Rudd and others, they've kind of run off in different directions. Now, he didn't really go the academic route, he went more towards his own development of what has become a very popular system, gene keys. In her case, she went very academic and did not really develop. I mean, she develops what she calls multidimensional human design, but I have the sense that that's one of her many, many, many academic research projects, and that actually a much bigger project for her is doing the work on what she calls basically the four worlds, which are the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual worlds, and kind of this larger undertaking of her own program, which human design was a stepping stone and something that she integrated. But at the same time, I really enjoyed to connect with her in that way, and I think part of it is that enough time has passed now that she was very interested in researching all these things quite a while ago when Ra was still trying to just establish human design. It's very difficult to establish something when you have a lot of different offshoots, and I think that was the real problem, was that Ra wasn't always able to find, or he would put his hopes in people that would develop something, but then he himself had his own dogmatic approach to certain things of saying, everyone would always ask him, what's the seven-centered body graph, something like that, and he would say, that's a dead end, why bother? Or how about the astrological significance? Well, astrologers don't really know that much, why bother? They're kind of a dead end. So Ra himself had this feeling of everything else is a dead end, why bother? And I think that, I mean, I won't say that it was his karma for it, although as a fifth line, I know that I myself have a lot of karma in that regard, but it was almost like his blessing and his curse that he was so brilliant and so committed to human design that he was unwilling to explore some of these other avenues that other people just want to. I'm actually very similar, and it might surprise people because I actually don't study that many different avenues, but then I will, and when I do study them, I want to get to the end of them to at least have seen what was there and sort of surveyed it and organized it in some way. So when I look into multidimensional human design, I want to actually look at all of these times, and then I want to ask, all right, what would it take to actually do this? And of course, as an innocence transference, which I very much, some of the most valuable human design work that's been in the actual day-to-day life is just noticing color transference. That's something I feel like, I mean, I'll just go through and I'll just notice curiosity, observing, but I'll notice, okay, I can't go too far into that curiosity because I'll start to kind of think, what would it really take to validate this? I would need to look at these charts and kind of look at, and start to see the differences. And then I just think I'm really glad that Dr. Haspel-Portner is doing this work because she does publish work and she does have books on it. She can share the work because that's not something that I would be able to do. And I also think that my goal, again, when someone comes to me, is to actually be able to help them in a practical way by helping them be more in touch with their strategy and authority. Whatever gets them more in touch with that. I mean, if it helps them, we've had these, conversations before about using the not self scare tactic. Well, no, we shouldn't just do that as a blanket for everyone, but some people need to be scared into it. Other people are already too scared. They need to be reassured they're on the right track. Some people are too worried. Some people aren't worried at all. I mean, people come to you in all different states of, from curiosity to demanding to earnest, sincere effort and everything in between. And I think as teachers, and because also something that Rob was very insistent on is that a human design reading is not sitting across from somebody telling them things about themselves. It is showing them how you arrived at those conclusions. And so there's a teaching element as well, or a sharing of that. And so it's my opinion that really when someone comes to me, I'm meant to do my darndest to align them to themselves by any means necessary, whatever's going to get them more in touch with that. That is kind of my goal. I'm a very desire oriented person. That's why I don't even always do readings. I do readings for periods of time. I go on hiatus for other periods of time. But when I do them, it's very different from teaching, even though there is a teaching component, as mentioned. But it's way more like, can I really get this person in touch with where their life force energy is? If they've been afraid to really truly live because they've been afraid what people will think of them, or they've been afraid what'll happen if they make a decision as themselves, I'm here to just give them that little push off the cliff and say, you can fly. But, I'm not here to tell them to answer a million questions about curiosity of this or that, or what the connections are, any of that.
Can we ask Marissa what she thought of all this?
I would love to hear from Marissa. If you'd like to share, Marissa, you're welcome.
Sure. Oh, a little noisy because I'm just at the gas station. But yeah, it's really fascinating to me. I see the point about there's all kinds of offshoots and all things to look at, but I definitely know that I'm a sucker for that stuff, good or bad, I've always liked to look, I shouldn't say always, but I've gotten into this pattern of really digging into moment by moment analysis of transits, leading up to an event or something like that as well. And so I think it's fascinating that there's something even more, even at another level potentially. We had a lot of work to be done on it, but yeah.
Exactly, and I also share the same approach to transits as you, where we both kind of have some similar backgrounds in multiple ways, but yeah, I actually have been a member of Mundane Astrologers Facebook group where they look at the astrological events, or I love things like the Pluto return of 1776 actually happening right now, stuff like that. No, I mean, to me, this is just it kind of scratches that itch. And so, as a desire innocence person, my outer authority and my awareness when it's given to others is really mostly given to kind of in a locked in way, like a goal oriented way. At the same time, I do like to read these different things, explore these different things when I'm ready. I open up to it and then I kind of go to the end of it to see what I can get from it that I could use, because to me it is always goal oriented, it is always desire oriented. I think for Johnny, for instance, who was here earlier, he's innocence, and it's going to be opposite for him. He's going to mostly be in his innocence and able to tell me what he's observed, what he's learned, what he knows. Periodically, he'll go into desire for the purposes of innocence, for the purposes of discovering and observing something new. So he will periodically say, oh, I need to do this, I'm going to build this thing, I'm going to do this thing now because I want to see what that's all about. So he even got really interested, for instance, in multidimensional human design. He's a defined head Ajna, so I'm so glad. He said, could we just build our own generator and do our own analysis of the charts we already have and see it? I said, yeah, we actually could, meaning he could, and I could be there to help him if he gets stuck, but he can do that work because, that's the kind of thing where somebody who does have a defined head in Ajna who wants to look through a bunch of body graphs, great, go for it and see what you find. In fact, that actually is an interesting side note. Dr. Haspel-Portner did look through the 30,000 birth charts that were collected by Lois Rodin that were all rated. And I don't know if they were all A-rated or AA rated, but these were all at least somewhat highly rated or good. I think she may have taken the higher rated, ones that had birth certificates, one that actually had autobiographically confirmed details. And she tried to look at different things like, was there a correlation between heart failure and having a defined heart or not? And she found no, she could not find any correlation in that sample set. But she did find some interesting correlations. So that's actually a sample set that Lois Rodin had previously used to try to see if there were correlations between prominent Mars placements and athletes, athleticism, things like that. So they're all tagged. Every body graph is tagged, so you can see, are there more athletes who are a certain type? Are there more musicians who have 1222? Are there more singers with a defined throat or undefined, and so on?
Fascinating. Yeah.
I know you
I
have
mean,
quite
I
a
just
collection as
think
well.
there's so much still to discover within human design that I don't want to waste my energy yet on something else.
Well, exactly, and I know that you also have quite a collection of body graphs, and I think just without
Yeah.
even looking at any of these other, like I don't even look at the dream rave for these body graphs. I mean, I'm not even because even that is kind of like, okay, maybe I could do weak point analysis, but do I really need to understand the psychology, or can I gain enough interesting information about who that person was and how they lived in the world mechanically, because that's what it's really showing, not psychologically, but mechanically. And I think some of these other levels may really give you a multidimensional view of someone. And that's really the question of like how much. I mean, I love Carl Jung's work enough. I might do a multidimensional body graph of his work just to see if something crazy is there, like something. But to me, it's almost like when you know a body graph so much like the back of your hand, then that something opens up in these other calculations that might be interesting. And also just for certain people. One final point though that I did like is that I don't normally think about certain gates and channels all that much that I don't have. And I don't even really think about my relationship to them very much. And one interesting thing that I did get from the conversation with Dr. Haspel-Portner is that she did say, so what's your relationship to gate one, or something like that. And I had to think about it, like I don't have 1 or 8, but every person who's alive has a relationship to gate one. All of
Mhm.
us have creative expression, right? So it's an interesting idea of kind of like one of the things she was getting at was in looking at these, like even if you don't have these gates in your body graph, you still have a relationship to them. And what if they were imprinted at key points that will make that relationship fixed in a certain way? What that means, you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of work, and it's like I don't want to put the work into that when I still have work to do just trying to figure out what shows us in the normal body graph, right?
Yeah.
If I can see that. But if I am really stumped and I can't figure something out, like I am kind of curious now. What if people who have splenic definition in one of these other charts but have undefined normally are kind of more susceptible to getting hooked on the spleen than others? Like I don't have a defined spleen in any of them. So maybe I'm more immune to getting hooked on splenic conditioning or something because none of my imprints possibly have spleen. I want to hear what Rachel has to say on this. Do you have any? What does the quad right say? If I can pull from the quad right.
Let's see.
You've absorbed this over the past week. You've absorbed quite a lot.
I want to look at I probably want to look at my body graph in this dimension to see. I'd be curious in those body graphs that are like 90 minutes pre and post, people that have actually something that changes, that may be a big definition. I would like to look at those people, like that would be my, investigated nature, like something that changes a lot in that little space.
Yeah, you're born right on the cusp.
Yeah, of something
Well,
changing, and then what would that look like?
And here would be a really good one. I know twins that were born, they were non-identical twins born about an hour apart. And one's a projector and one's a generator. And they were pretty different. But the generator maybe would then have a projector emotional under. I mean, I don't think we can even use the type words in this case. We're not even using type words. All we're in the same way that when Ra looks at the solar return chart or the Saturn return chart or the Uranus opposition or the Chiron return, he really looks at the nodes and he looks at the incarnation cross and he looks at the profile. And some people try to interpret the gates and the channels and all these things. It's so hard to do that. Like it doesn't mean the same thing to have had that gate active at a solar return chart. It doesn't mean the same thing. The solar return chart is this moment in time where, that gate happened to be active, but what if the Sun-Earth, which is the 70% of the neutrinos of that time from the Sun, that
Yeah, but if you're
profile,
talking about a solar return,
yeah.
the Sun Earth are going to be the same.
Oh, well, excuse me.
So
Not the
some
solar
of
return, the
the
Saturn
other
return.
returns.
The Saturn
Yeah,
return, the Saturn. Looks
yeah.
at the Sun Earth of the Saturn return. The solar return, you're right. You look at educational channels and you look at more detail. So the solar return has its own rules where you don't really look at the profile because it's always the same, of course. You don't look at incarnation cross, it's always the same, but you do look at the nodes and you look at the gates and the channels. The Saturn return, you don't really look at gates and channels, or at least Ra didn't. And I'm sure that you could say, okay, this channel is going to color my Saturn return in some way, but we don't necessarily know um, the sense that it colors the Saturn return. See what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
we know that in some sense it does, but how do we really
yeah.
interpret that? We haven't looked at the thousands of charts necessary to really be able to like confirm what that would actually do.
So when I did
Similarly,
my Saturn return, it was totally amazing because it was like 3 days before I left England to come to the States. I mean, it was like
the timing being so perfect. Yeah.
just
No, I've had
totally changed my life. I left medical school. I just totally left everything else. Well, I went with my ex-husband, but the rest of my life changed totally.
wow. Yeah. Yeah, no, those I mean, and those are obviously there are so many synchronistic things where I've known somebody who, got a drunk driving ticket and then ended up at the exact day of their Saturn return overnight in jail or something like that. These like they really learned the Saturn lesson of you don't do that. And then other people who've had really good experiences or fated, a lot of fate happens around the Saturn return. You're kind of forcibly moved to your correct environment. A lot of times people really leave their family home and things like that.
I think Genoa had a very humiliating experience around his Saturn return. So
For
things
a lot
where
of
you
us, it's
have to reassess your life.
it's very humbling. It clips our wings in some sense and tells us to be adults. And also, what Ra would talk about is the stage of life. It's kind of a grace that you might have a number of children with different environments. It's okay, they can all live in the same place together. It's only really in their 30s that the environment becomes harmful to be in the wrong one, so to speak, because that's the stage. I mean, certainly it's always beneficial, and certainly you can always find the right environment or simulacrums of it. You can find a porch that's kind of like a shore. But when somebody really turns 30, they do need to kind of fulfill they need to go to their right stage, go to their right place.
Uh-huh.
So,
I think of it as what we need for our healing. And I
that
treat
too.
the dietary regime in the same way. If you're sick, that's the most important time when, for me, to become really simple in what I eat. But I mean, am I living on an artificial shore that I'm living next to a river which doesn't flow most of the time?
You're kind of on the edge of town too. I mean, I think of artificial shores usually don't want to be right in the middle of things. Like if you were right in the plaza or right in it's kind of surrounded on all sides. You don't really want to be boxed in. You want to be kind of be able to be on the side of it all and not stuck.
Yeah, Genoa calls the ultimate artificial shore going out into space. I think of it as living in your imagination, like movies, books, things like that.
It's true. Yeah, artificial shores. People love those liminal spaces, and yeah. If you ever want to do any more interesting research, Marissa, or actually either of you. I know. I mean, you're always researching, Lisita, on different body graphs. I know you have your own catalog, but
Yeah, so I was using Lois Roden's Astro databank. I think
good.
she's now died, but
Yeah,
a lot of people are continuing that Astro Dean's site.
it's such a good website. Yeah, astrodeans.de or something like that or .com. But it's so fantastic. So I kind of approach these multidimensional body graphs the same way I would approach, with the same caution I would approach solar return, Saturn return, any of these life cycle charts or global cycles where we really can't interpret them the same way. The same way that Genoa reminds us not to treat the global cycle incarnation cross as a human incarnation cross. No human has the current cross of planning. It's all first lines. It's not like it's a 1-3 or something. So that because it's 90-degree angles, not 88-degree angles. And so because of that point as well, I think we just need to keep in mind and just have the caution. As a gate 12, I'll be the voice of caution of just always kind of asking at what level the interpretive value there might be interpretive value and see if we can find it. We might not be able to find it. It might just be an interesting fact that doesn't really add or give us anything or really tell us anything new other than just being an interesting fact. Or we might find something really, really powerful that might actually really change our perspective. So I just like exploring these to the fullest. I had the same sort of relationship to Steve Rhodes and to the work on Bantu that he's done, where a lot of people haven't really gone that deep into tones and into actually, he claims to have read 2,000 biographies of different historical figures, that he's an avid biography fan and just avid reader, and that he actually then would look at their body graphs and make observations about their tones, and he learned a lot from that. And so I think this is valuable work, and it's not for everyone, but that's what human design is all about: finding your work. What is your work? And if Dr. Haspel-Portner is right, and we are 95% of us are composite manifesting generators, then no matter what our type, we all have work to do. Some of us are just more collaborative or don't have consistent access to the different centers and so on. So, any thoughts more on that side of it? I mean, how would it be about the world being mostly manifesting generator? What is that like? Right?
Oh, well, I don't
Sure
know.
seems that
I was
way.
going to comment more on the charts, and like looking at a solar return chart is kind of like you get the information post, like after the thing is, like you can see it maybe before it happens, but you don't really know what's going to happen till after it actually happens, to see, oh, there it was in my chart. That's kind of how I'm looking at these
Yeah, it would be
multidimensional charts.
It'd be much harder to predict, but you might find explanations for differences that aren't shown normally. And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. Like, why do some undefined spleen people have a really hard time letting go of people who define their spleen?
Yeah.
Maybe they have such a strong emotional, relational attachment,
Right.
more than some others who have undefined spleen, who are actually Ra kind of generalized and said, hey, if you have undefined spleen, you're so clingy and attached.
Yeah.
Well, he might have been using his information from somebody who had undefined spleen, but had it defined on the emotional, or who knows what. There could have been some other configurations. I mean, the other thing that no chart is going to show, and only knowing the person will really tell you, is, and sometimes you can't know at all because there's no way to know, you don't have access to the birth info, what was it like for them growing up? For me, growing up as a generator with a reflector mother, I was basically getting access to all of these transits coming in through her aura that was broadcasting them to me through her temporary emotional definition or temporary this or that, And that's a very different life experience than someone who's unemotional, growing up with emotionally defined parents, for instance, or undefined spleen with a defined spleen parent, things like that. So, I mean, it's a similar level of analysis of kind of, we can almost call it etiological analysis. That's how the psychoanalysts would call it. What's the etiology of it? It means the source of the illness. But of course, we're not talking about an illness here, so that's not really, unless we think of the mind as a virus or something like that. But anyway, how did it all begin? Okay, well, this is... Oh, yeah, nice comment here. She's only wanted to hear more about what it's like having a reflector mom. Well, maybe I'll do a special session with Rima. I could invite her. She would, especially now that it's getting lighter later. She's a daylight person. She's direct light. But I could invite her, maybe I'll invite her down next week, and we can do a little Q&A, reflector... reflector generator. That'd be fun.
Yeah, let's see to give a thumbs up.
Okay, I'll invite her down. That'd be great.
Oh, and then
Let's see if she
Marissa
wants
says
to
on
join. Yeah, wonderful.
Okay.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for being
Yeah.
on this journey today, and thanks to you too. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah.
So nice after the time change. Now it's like
Still
sunny,
light.
late. It's still light. I think we're gonna go out and get a little sun.
Sun.
So maybe, yeah.
All right,
Maybe
bye,
maybe
guys.
we'll see you at the park if you happen to be walking there. Maybe we'll go for a little walk. All right,
Okay.
take care.
Yeah.
See you.